Hi everyone, I'm Rikker Dockum. I'm here to talk to you today about opening a closed class, sociolinguistic factors in the expansion of Thai pronominals. So this builds on some well-known but now quite aged work, that of Joseph Cook in 1968, who did a really important study on pronominal reference comparing Thai, Burmese, and Vietnamese. So he looked at what everyone would be familiar with as personal pronouns, but also nouns used pronominally of other varieties. So this includes kinship terms, status terms, and titles. So everything from Mr. and Mrs. type terms to professional occupations and royal titles and other things, but also names. Names themselves are used pronominally in this part of the world, which will be news to few. And so, drawing from interviews and other material and literature, he compared some of the differences. And in one of the suggestions he made, which has piqued my interest, is the idea that unlike how we typically think of pronouns as a paradigm, that in this region, and so in Thai also, pronominals may be more of an open class rather than a closed class. So there's a sort of unlimited, in theory, number of names, titles, kinship terms, and then other pronouns that can be used for reference. And so when you combine those all together, it's not closed like you would typically think. So in his study, Cook observed a variety of course, very typical looking pronouns. And noted that those are used in all three persons, but these other pronominal nouns tended to focus in first and second person usage. And noted that an areal pattern in Southeast Asia is this need for awareness of social distance between interlocutors. So that just means being aware of your relative kinship, your age, your socioeconomic status with respect to one another, social rank, titles, and whether you're familiar with each other or not. So these all, of course, govern the way we speak to each other in any language, but it affects the specific choice of pronominal reference in this part of the world. But beyond those general patterns, Cook also saw some language-specific differences. So this included things like the degree that gender and politeness are encoded in pronominals is not the same across the three languages of his study. And for instance, Burmese, while it uses some nouns in both ways, so more just typical nominal versus more pronominal, you can diagnose which way it's being used by which kind of plural it takes. So there's extra information which helps you analyze what's going on. Another one is that kin rank. He concluded that kin rank was more important in Vietnamese than in Thai and Burmese. But also made the observation that while Thai has a plural marker that's used with pronouns, there is no special pronominal plural marker, unlike in the other two. So yeah, so there's a mix of both areal patterns and specifics, and this is why it behooves us to dig in deeper. So if you pull out a Thai textbook, you'll probably see, here are your pronouns, and you'll see something like pom, which is a first person singular, often called masculine pronoun, or dichan. Dichan is usually classified as female or feminine these days, although there's of course work on use of indexing femininity by transgender Thai speakers. So there is an interesting literature on all of that as well, which I'd encourage everyone to look into. There is the pronoun rao, typically called plural, but is also used in the singular, and in fact has been for a very long time. Then we have kun, you, second person singular, kao or kao, he or she, third person singular, typically human, and then man, which is often translated as it, which is third person singular, non-human or non-animate, but is also used with humans in an impolite way. And so you can pluralize any of these with puak, which means group. So you have pom, and you can have puak pom, puak rao, puak kun, puak kao, that kind of thing. So there's this way of marking plurals, but it's not a specifically pronominal pluralizer. It also just means group. So you can have puak in front of a variety of nouns. So that's sort of what you might see in a textbook. That's just really scratching the surface. Now, if you get beyond the first couple of chapters, you might learn some more. You might learn kapachao, a polite first person singular. You might learn chan, which is a familiar first person singular. Toeng or taeng, which is an even more familiar and typically feminine coded. But again, these things are variable. Familiar term, which of course is also used non-pronominally just to mean oneself, myself, yourself, etc. Rao I've included here again in the first person singular. So, you might on page 1 of the textbooks be taught it's plural and then learn, oh, well, actually, it's singular. There's others like te and tan. Tan is polite and te is familiar. And the way these have been used and where they come from really has varied over time. And so it can be a little tricky to try and capture all that. So there's, of course, even more. There's stuff the point here isn't for me to finally detail all of the connotations and variable usage. The complexity is really the point. So there's more like ge, lon, or even like dai tao, dai fa, pa ba. Like you can get as polite or as familiar as you want. It goes in all directions. So what I want to do now is take a step back and look at where this system came from. So in the 1960s, Matsuyama did a reconstruction of a Proto-Tai paradigm and found a three-way person distinction and a three-way number distinction, and also an inclusive-exclusive distinction in the first person plural. And so then a couple of decades later, Strecker came along and added some detail. So sort of added some more fine brush strokes to identify some differences from what Matsuyama had found, and similarly found a three-way person distinction, found a three-way number distinction in the first and second person only, the inclusive-exclusive distinction previously mentioned, and then also this human animacy distinction. It can vary from language to language, whether it's human, non-human, animate, inanimate, whether it's human versus human, polite, impolite. There's a range of meanings, of course, for all of the reflexes of these words. And you can see that there's variable forms as well. So this is, somewhat not entirely settled as to why exactly we get different forms, like you have the gu versus the gao versions and the mu versus mau for these different ones. But the end result is there's a 10 pronoun reconstructed paradigm. And this is the ancestor system for all of the Thai languages. So just to say one more thing. So if we look at that, of the 10, we see 3 distinct forms that are really still used in this unmarked way, and then 2 more that are used in a marked way, the gu and mung. And so here are the forms that those come from, just to show you what the Thai looks like, from the reconstructed Proto-Tai by Strecker, and the modern Thai forms. Okay. Now, what of course is loaded even to say that it's impolite. You can, use these supposedly impolite ones in familiar company without any offense. It shows this level of awareness, social complexity that's typical in the region and with Thai. So what I am doing in this study is just really beginning to scratch the surface of tracing the trajectory of Thai pronouns. And so what I've chosen to do in this study is to look at a range of dictionaries. Now, we can infer things from natural language texts, right? So there's certainly plenty of old texts. But the fact that they are created in a certain social context means we're not going to see the full range of pronouns. We're going to see some of them, and so that remains to be studied in more detail. So, but what I chose as a starting point is let's look at dictionaries, because dictionaries will often include multiple versions and tell you whether it's polite or impolite. It has this pedagogical goal. We have a variety that show up starting in the 19th century. There are things that are dictionary-like older than that, but there's a nice comparison set within this fairly tight range of 6 or 7 decades. So we have both monolingual Thai dictionaries, Thai English, English Thai, Thai Latin, French English even, thanks to the Catholics. But of course, I should note that although these are typically attributed to foreigners, they are all only made possible through the often uncredited work of native assistants. So some go as far as to say that we know like the name of one of the helpers of one of the dictionaries. A lot of them say, assistance from native assistants, and that's all they say. Others don't mention it. So there's a range of credit given to. But in fact, the first sort of Western-style Thai dictionary didn't come along until the 20th century. Compiled by Thais, for Thais, that kind of thing. Though, of course, Thai has a long tradition of instructional material dating back centuries. So people will have heard of the Jindamani and other things. Okay. So the ones that I looked at here are, oops, a typo there. Eliza Grew Jones's 1833 manuscript. So she died in 1838 and produced this manuscript, which is often given credit to her husband, who lived another 15 or 20 years. But in fact, we know from his diary that, and her diary, in fact, that she's the one who compiled it and finished it quite early, just less than a year, or maybe just a very short time after they arrived in Siam. They had been working on it in Singapore with Thai speakers. So not long after they arrived in Thailand, this manuscript of many thousands of words she declares that she's finished it, and it was never published. Perhaps due to her death, perhaps just due to the fact that there was no printing press in Siam at the time. The first one to print in Thai was in Singapore, and then it wasn't until Dan Beach Bradley brought one in about a decade after her death, 5 to 10 years after her death in the 1840s, that they started printing things locally. So you also have in addition to the Jones Dictionary, you have the Caswell Dictionary, another manuscript. This one is Thai. You have Palagwa's, this is the Catholic bishop, Palagwa, or priest, I forget his title specifically, had a 4-language dictionary. Dan Beach Bradley has the first published Thai dictionary in 1873. And then Michel, who was a civil servant and lawyer, published a Thai English one in the 1890s. So there's a range here, right? So I've done something very simple to start, which is just to sort of look through and mark with a plus or a minus or an equal sign or an X whether these terms are found and what they look like. So a plus means it's noted as being used for polite company or speaking to people of high status. A minus sign means that it's used in for people of low status. This is mentioned in the dictionary, so this isn't me saying this. This is what do the dictionary compilers actually note. An equal sign means it's defined as meaning, you, me, I, whatever they defined it as, but without any specific mention of status. And then an X means that it's not there. So you see that in some of these, there are gaps in what they actually were working on. So Palagwa, despite having something like that 5,000 entries, seems to be missing most of the sort of conversational words like pronouns. So that's an interesting thing to note. Of course, there was an 1896 expanded version by one of his helpers, followers, whatever you want to call it. So potentially it could expand this to look at that again in the 1890s, but we wouldn't necessarily know what represented mid-19th century versus late 19th century, so I chose to exclude it here. But there's not much to explain about this. This is just, you can look at this if you want. This is sort of looking at what is noted as being polite or impolite. So we can do this with the first person, just like I just did. We can also look at the second person. So we have these terms, mung, jiao, eng, kun. So these are varying second person pronouns. And we can look similarly at places where they start to appear. So notably here, I would point at kun, which is the one which is like the textbook word for you, the one they will teach every new Thai speaker. Doesn't actually show up as a pronoun until the last 120 years or so. So prior to that, it would have had other usage, but was not a typical second person pronoun for most of the 19th century. So some of this is quite recent change in the long scheme of things. Here's a quick look. I just picked a couple of the third person, although third is misspelled. The third person pronouns kao and man, and you can see also when it's kao has been pretty stable across time, not polite, not rude, just is a general term. And then mun is noted at the early in the century in 1833 as being a word used with inferiors, and in again in Michel 1892 still being mentioned as a rude word. So having looked at those, I just want to do a quick look through the etymology of some specific ones. So let's just take some case studies. So what did we actually replace the native paradigm with? So let's look at ka, which is a widespread term in the family. So this is actually a really common replacement for a word meaning servant or slave to be used in a first-person pronoun way. And so reflexes of ka are used very far and wide in the family. So this is not unique to Thai, but it's one that we do see in Thai. So it's reconstructed from the Proto-Tai etymological, according to the most recent reconstruction, but from Pithiapon 2009. And if we look at the translations of how Bradley defined ka, he says a word to refer to oneself like rao or gu. So this is what I mean when I say no specific mention of it being polite or impolite. Whereas if you have kapajao, also in Bradley's dictionary, a word to humble oneself, I who am your servant. Okay. If we look at Michel 1892, similar story, except he notes that ka by itself is used towards an inferior, a social inferior, and kapajao, since both forms he noted are possible, kajao and kapajao is I or me when speaking to an equal or a superior. So that's an interesting one where the kapachao came to be equals as well as superiors. And so nowadays that's really true. You can use kapachao as a sort of polite equal term with equals, but also superiors. Okay, so that's a change that would have potentially happened over the course of the 19th century. How about pom? So we have one that came from a word meaning slave. We have another one that came from a word meaning hair. So this is one that students of Thai and many people will have noticed is a homophone, but in fact it is directly connected. So this is from the reconstructed Proto-Tai etyma, something like brum, according to Pithiapon. And if we look at Bradley's definition, we have the same as kapachao or chun or dichan, used when speaking with venerated people who are not royalty. You must refer to yourself as gapom. So this is a specific use of it, a specific version of it. And Michel in 1892 notes it's a term meaning I or me that is respectful, or it's also a term for hair. And so the connection here is that if you look in different texts, gapom or grapom, as it's still used sometimes now in Thai, actually comes from glaupom, which is the act of tying up your hair in a top knot. And so there's this pattern that we see referring to either exalted or debased parts of the body, usually the head and the feet, as a way of either exalting the person you're talking to or debasing yourself in their presence. So this is the same principle when you say, if you refer to yourself as glaupom, talking to someone higher status than you, then you are giving them respect. And interestingly, you can do the opposite too. So tai tao, meaning beneath the feet, is a polite pronoun used like with judges. So it means something like your excellency or your honor, people of certain status. And then of course like dai fa pabad and these other terms for talking to royalty, where you're literally putting yourself below the feet of the person you're talking to. So we see this body part terminology used. And this seems to be unique to Thai, at least with this specific etyma. I have not yet found pom used in a first person, in a pronominal sense. This is the one that interests people a lot because there's a lot of sort of, I guess, I don't know, mind-blowingness to this one. So dichan, which is typically indexed as feminine nowadays, and its shortened version chan, or first person singular. Jones in 1833 defines it as a slave or an inferior person. I myself, your humble servant, abbreviated chan, in books written as dichan. Okay, so what's going on there, right? So you have this early reference that it's specifically used for you're calling yourself very inferior to your interlocutor. Then in Caswell 1846, a word used to refer to oneself, no mention of status. A word used to refer to yourself used by city people. This is an interesting comment. So dichan was a city term, an urban term. Polyglot 1854 mentions it's used when speaking to superiors. Bradley 1873 doesn't mention anything about particular status. And 1892, Michel finally mentions it's become a term used by women. And so this is at the turn of the 20th century when we start to see this change in who uses this term. But where did it actually come from? Well, it almost certainly is from the Bali term dirachana, so animal or beast. And we see this because we can be fairly certain of this because if we look at the forms in 19th century dictionaries, for the first person singular we see di-chan, de-chan, di-chan, chan, chun. We see all of those. We also see for the term meaning animal, dirachan, dirachan, derachan, dirachan. And so we know that, for instance, the comment they're saying written in books as di-chan with the long vowel. So it's plausible that the long vowel is the original form. Chan and chun both existed as abbreviated forms, but chun became shortened over time. Now, where the R went, that's your guess, but given the social pattern of debasing yourself to talk to superiors, and that the earliest records say that it was a term used to sort of call yourself very low, that's how you exalted the person you're talking to, that there's almost certainly this is the origin. And so this is the bit that is often interesting to folks, I found. So we can look at another one, eng, which probably comes from eng, meaning the self, but it has come to have a short vowel, which was not distinguished in writing. So this length contrast didn't exist until, or at least was not phonemic until no later than probably the 1910s, based on my work with Dockum and Pidiapon in 2019, where we were figuring out some of the points at which length contrasts were emerging, but certainly was not written. It wasn't contrasted in writing until fairly recently. But nonetheless, we can see Bradley, 1873, saying a word that an elder or high status person uses to refer to someone younger than themselves or to a slave. So it was used in this pronominal-like way, beyond just the eng, meaning the self, that is probably its origin. And finally, we have kun. So kun comes from Bali guna, virtue, and so the earliest references it made, it was originally only used as jiaokun. And so this is a case of where the bit that was actually originally the pronoun was lost, and the part that was the modifier on the pronoun is what actually stayed behind. So jiaokun, a word to refer to a high status person. You, the master of virtue, is how Bradley wrote it and how I've translated that. So you are saying jiaokun, you know, this lord of or master of virtue. And then by Michel, 1892, a couple of decades later, saying in addressing nobles, it means sir or your excellency as jiaokun, but you can just use it as a polite term for anyone to address a person as sir. Okay, so these are just some examples of the type of work I've been digging through. So to wrap up real quick, originally Proto-Tai had this very typical looking reconstructed paradigm. And as Cook suggested, there's this complex network of uses and meanings that speakers of languages in this area have to be aware of, which makes it behave more like an open class. But certainly it's undergone a lot of lexical replacement and diversification as these different social trends have come to be reflected in the language, things like gender and status, that are not always present in the related languages. So in the other Thai languages, often these things are absent. This is how we can say that we are confident that this is a pattern in Thai. So we've seen, native Thai words tending to be replaced with words that have this more explicit indexing of social relationships. So the loan words meaning something like virtue or beastliness. We also see words, for the hair or the feet recruited from within Thai to serve a new purpose. And so what remains to be done is still a lot of differentiation between what are the areal trends. So there's some things like we know the importance of kinship terms as a pronominal-like noun, but we also can look at Cook, who said that that varies between languages as well. So there's a lot of work left to do. Excuse me, and this is just the start. So anyway, thank you for listening.